talking about resistance training and its effects on bone. The first point I'm going to focus on is the perceptions that we have as a society towards aging and self-efficacy, particularly in terms of wisdom. Because the argument I'm going to make is that these perceptions of aging are the principal reasons why we see issues of bone mineral density with age. And the second point I'm going to make is more mechanical. Basically, how mechanical stimulation is essential for bone development, specifically how it needs to be high force, high power, or have a high degree of ground reactive forces. We're also going to talk about the importance of stimulating the bone in novel ways. That includes odd types of forces. And we're also going to talk about how frequency of stimulation is important, as well as how specific exercises can be used to target the areas we're most concerned about in terms of bone development. So to get us started on this concept of perception of aging, I'm going to play something for you that I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with.
Light call, my 24-hour emergency medical response service.
I've fallen, and I can't get up.
All right, so many of you will remember this advertisement. What concerns me is that in our society it's considered normal and not surprising for an elderly woman to not be able to live independently and on her own. More specifically, it doesn't surprise people that she needs a walker to get around, or that she needs life shield. Because aging has come to mean for us the gradual degradation of the person. Their physical body, their mental body, is considered almost like a medical condition or disease. And the people who help care for our elders are often thought of as humoring them and not respecting and venerating them for their wisdom and their contributions to our society. You can see that reflected in bone mineral density. So here we have bone mineral density on the y-axis in age in years. And so the typical paradigm that we always hear is that you build all the bone you're ever going to build by the age of 30. And if you follow the purple line and you aren't as physically active as other people, then you will never build as much bone as you need to prevent osteoporosis. So once you reach 30, you're destined to either get osteoporosis or not. You're helpless, it's hopeless, and there's nothing you can do. What I'd like to do is take a different look of aging and think about aging from a different perspective that I hope to become more of the norm.
During Blue Zone's first visit to Costa Rica, we met 99-year-old Panchita. In America, only 1 in 7 women over 100 can even take care of themselves. Panchita not only lives alone, she splits log and clears the bush with an enormous machete.
Isn't she awesome? That's from the Blue Zones project. It's a really cool book that I encourage you to read. What's interesting about that woman is if I kept showing you this video, you'd see how her 80-year-old son rides to see her on his bicycle every morning at 7 o'clock, at which point she's already been up for hours working. This is what we should consider to be healthy and normal aging, not helpless and hopeless decline. Now, I'm not going to romanticize the past at all. I, for one, am glad that we have dishwashers and washing machines. But I will say this much. In the old days, it was easier for us. It's part of our daily life to be loading our body, stressing our body, and getting physical activity. And nowadays, that's become quite difficult. Now that we have cars, now that laundry is something we just throw in instead of laboring over and carrying around, how exactly can we load our bones and load our body? And I know I'm borrowing and butchering a term from psychology here, but I think what that's led to, in part, is a sense of learned helplessness. And what I mean by that is this. If you go on Google and search for change a light bulb, this is what you get. And, you know, it's funny and it's also sad. You know what's particularly sad here? And by the way, the guys are great. Thanks for helping, guys. We appreciate it. That being said, why is that woman over, the blondes, why is she so scared of changing the light bulb? It's ridiculous. But that's where we are. And it doesn't help that this is the image that we think of when we think of as health. Here you have 2 women on the beach, barefoot, lifting a tiny amount of weight. Their hair is down. They're wearing jewelry, but they do have a power move, as you can see. I assure you that that is not doing much for bone mineral density at all. So why am I blabbering on about independence? Why does it matter? And the reason it matters is actually quite simple. We think of bone as static, but it's not. Bone is constantly in a state of remodeling. So if we look in at the bone, we have osteoclasts constantly breaking down the bone and releasing calcium into the bloodstream when we need it. And at the same time, we have osteoblasts, which are constantly depositing a collagen matrix on which new bone can be built. And osteoblasts can become part of bone in a sense, as they're converted into osteocytes. But what's really important is not just that this constant process is, again, constant, but also that it's sensitive to the load we press on bone. So osteoblasts and osteocytes both respond to what we tell the skeleton to do. I think this was put very well in this review by Frost in 1997, where he said healthy postnatal load-bearing bones are designed to have only enough strength to help chronically subnormal, normal, supernormal, voluntary loads and not injuries from causing spontaneous fractures. What that means for us is this. If the load that your bone sustains is simply you sitting around all day, which I know is not the case for you guys, but as an example, that's how strong your bones will be. So loads that should be normal, loads like going out and chopping wood, are going to cause possibly a risk of fracture. In other words, what you do to your bone determines how strong that bone is. In fact, only 3 to 10% of bone strength is attributed to a lot of the things we talk about all the time, from hormones to vitamins to dietary calcium. I mean, think about this. It doesn't matter how much calcium you pump into someone in bed rest. They are still going to lose a significant amount of bone just because they're not moving. In fact, 40% of bone strength can be attributed directly to the mechanical stress that we place on bone. So the point I'm trying to emphasize here is, again, bone is only as strong as we tell it to be, and habitual activity, including exercise, is the primary determinant of bone mineral density. And that, of course, is, again, the importance of self-efficacy and a strong, independent approach to life. All right, so let's get into some mechanical stuff. What about the types of loads? Here we see bone and the different ways in which it can be loaded. But you'll see that bone can be compressed, it can experience tension, shearing forces. When it's exposed to these types of forces and deformation occurs, that's when it adapts. And what types of forces are we talking about here? We're talking about high force or high power types of load. And how does this load get exerted on bone? Well, first of all, muscle itself within the body exerts forces on bone. So if we look here, you see this arm muscle is lifting a weight from here to here. And what you'll notice in the graphic is that the muscle physically pulls on that bone to lift the weight up. And in doing so, it's causing that deformation, and thereby it's causing the adaptation. But you also can have forces from outside the body that can help stimulate bone production. So in this case, when you land from a jump, the impact from the ground reactive forces will also help stimulate bone deposition. So let's take this into a more practical standpoint. If we take a look at bone mineral density in different types of female athletes based on the sport that they perform, let's start with ground reactive forces. High impact types of sports, like volleyball and hurdling, where you're jumping up and landing. And what you'll see is, predictably, the bone mineral density in these types of athletes is higher than you would expect for the normal population. But it's also important to stimulate the bone in novel ways. And sports where you're cutting back and forth in high power types of movements, in this case we're talking about squash, soccer, speed, skating, step aerobics, those are not only important for developing bone mineral density, but they're also important for stressing the bones in novel ways so that different regions of the bones will also increase their bone mineral density. And what about high power? Now, in this case, in the particular study that I've been walking you through, we're talking about Olympic weightlifting, and what that is a specific set of exercises, cleans, jerks, and snatches, that are performed in a ballistic way, so the weight is lifted quite quickly. What's important, and we'll get back to later, is there's typically a ballistic initial movement followed by a catchphrase. Now, in the study I've been walking you through here, you don't see that weightlifting has too much of an impact, and that's primarily because the athletes in this particular study had not been weightlifting for very long. But if you look at this Conroy-Kramer paper from 1993, we're looking at junior weightlifters. Now, junior weightlifters, again, are teenagers. They're not expected to have reached peak bone mineral density quite yet. And what you'll see is, as you might expect, that when compared to controls, they have significantly higher bone mineral density. But in addition to that, when you compare them to adults who have reached peak bone mineral density, they have 113% of adult bone mineral density in the spine, and 131% of adult bone mineral density in the femoral neck, which is part of the hip. We'll discuss that a little later. So, what about low impact activities? Well, this is predictable. With lower impact activities, you're not loading the bone, you're not seeing the same types of adaptations. And non-impact or even negative impact, like cycling or swimming, what's interesting here is that these athletes might actually have lower bone mineral density than norms. And the reasons have to do with more than just loading. And recent meta-analysis just showed that the more hours of endurance exercise you perform, the lower your bone mineral density does tend to be. So it's clearly for reasons other than loads alone. Now, there's been a number of investigations that have looked at the effect of resistance exercise on bone mineral density. Dr. Miriam Nelson's study here is not the first nor the last to have looked at it. But when this came out, it made a huge splash. And part of the reason for this is simply because it was one of the first studies where they tried to use heavier loads. We're not even talking about the heaviest loads they could have used. We're talking about doing 8 repetitions at 80% of a 1 repetition maximum. Now, in this postmenopausal group, as you'd expect, the control group lost 2.5% of their bone mineral density in the hip and 1.8% in the lumbar spine, and that is considered normal by our current definition of normal. The trained group, however, gained 1% in both areas in just 1 year. They're putting almost a 4% difference between themselves and their colleagues, or just a regular person, in a single year. And what's also important is that they improved balance. They weren't working on balance, but they did, and that's important for fall prevention. They improved strength, which is an independent risk factor for literally the length of time that you live. They also improved other indicators of overall health. So they didn't just improve bone mineral density, they improved their health as a whole. But if I was really going to make my point about the importance of high force on bone mineral density, you'd want to look at the people who lift the most weight. Now, in this diagram, what you're seeing is on the top x-axis is age, so it goes from 30 to 70, and we're really only interested in the 50-year-olds here. And on the y-axis, you see peak scores for bone mineral density. So 0, which you see the gray line in the middle, that's the mean bone mineral density at different ages. Black line above and black line below are 1 standard deviation above and below. You see that orange line there? Underneath that line, that's considered osteopenia. So if you look at that population of 50-year-olds right there, you'll notice that about half of them do have osteopenia if they're left to age normally. And then, of course, under the red line would be osteoporosis. So say we took powerlifters, and unlike the name suggests, powerlifters are people, both men and women, who lift as much weight as they possibly can in the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press. So if you think about it, what do you think that they would do? Do you think they'd be at 1 standard deviation above the mean, maybe 2? Remember, these are 50-year-old women. In this case study of 2 elite powerlifters, these women had up to 3 standard deviations above the mean, depending on the area of their body that was looked at. In all cases, that these women were not at risk for osteoporosis in old age. And that has been supported by other studies. In one retrospective analysis, an investigator found that the more women lifted, the more weight they lifted in his study, the greater the bone mineral density they saw. And a more recent JSCR article did show that lifting at or near your 1 repetition maximum certainly did have improvements for bone mineral content. So how often should we be loading bone in these different types of ways? All I'll say about this is the more frequently, the better. As you can see in this diagram, 7 days is better than less than 7 days. And a recent investigation pointed out that at least twice a week is ideal. So doing some of these types of forces and activities twice a week is what we're looking for. So again, high force, high power, or ground reactive forces in odd directions and in ways that are novel to bone and that are done frequently, at least twice a week. So what exercises should we be using in order to use these different types of forces? And to answer that question, I want to take a moment to talk about the fracture sites that we see most often in elderly individuals. The first one, and the most important in my mind, is the hip, and here's why. all hip fractures are associated with morbidity. 20% of individuals who have a hip fracture, 20% will die within 1 year. 30% will have a permanent disability. 40% will be unable to walk independently, which has independent repercussions for their cardiovascular health as well. And a full 80% will be unable to carry out at least one independent activity of daily living. But when we talk about hip fracture, it's a little bit of a misnomer, because what we're really talking about is the thigh bone or femur, which you see over here. There's an aspect of the femur that projects out into the hip socket, and that's the femoral neck. That's the weak link here that is prone to breaking. But what's also interesting to know about this anatomy is that your hips and your pelvis sits on that femoral neck. And so the more that you stress the upper body and its weight on the lower body, the more you're helping to spur some motor neural density there. So as you can imagine, given this anatomy, someone who sits a lot and is not loading that bone is going to have lower bone mineral density than simply someone who stands a little bit more often. But what we'll also want to do is use exercises, resistance exercises that load the upper body in a standing position so that we're loading that femoral bone. But there's also specific types of exercises that might be good for loading the bone in different ways. And as you can imagine, there's really not a lot of randomized controlled trials going for a year where they did just squats versus just lunges. But there is, for example, this abstract that did some bone modeling and showed that, in general, single leg movements tended to load the femoral bone a little bit more than double leg. And if you look at the skeleton, you can kind of see why this would be. Check out the femoral notch over there. You'll notice that you're loading it in a way that would simply be novel to the bone, a little bit different for the bone, and more specific to one side versus the other. That's not to say that you don't want to do the squats. It's just saying have a little bit of single leg in there as well. But what is also important is ground reactive forces. Now what's interesting about this is that in some populations that are extremely sedentary, simply doing heel drops, which is what you see on the left here, simply doing heel drops alone will help to start build that bone mineral density. But that cannot be the end point. It should progress. And it can progress quite quickly to vertical jumps. So jumping is great, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that will help the femoral neck. But also odd impacts sports. So you can progress people gradually to the point where they can do tennis and basketball and things that are going to have them moving around at different angles and stimulating bones in different ways. So in support of this, a recent meta-analysis did find that high-impact types of activities do improve hip bone mineral density, but not the spine. And so the next logical question would be, what do we do to load the spine? And the answer is quite simple. Anything you do that loads the upper body is going to load the spine, because that weight has to be transferred through the spinal column. So if you're lifting a box, if you're lifting any weights in the upper body, that spine is being loaded. So the question is not how to load the spine, really. It's how to load the spine properly to prevent injury. You've all probably heard the lift with your legs and not your back statement. That's part of this concern and consideration. A normal spine, which you see on the left here, has some healthy neutral curves in it. Those are natural, those are normal. That's how you want the spine to look, regardless of what the person is doing. But with age, and also with a lack of fitness, you'll start to see changes in the spine, usually a little bit of kyphosis and lordosis over time. And you don't want to load the spine in that specific way, because not only are you risking some fractures in the spine by loading the spine in a bad posture, you're also putting the person at risk for disc injuries as well. So what does this mean from a practical standpoint? It means that not only are you interested in a neutral spine when you're working with people one-on-one, but you also have to make sure that they're keeping a neutral spine in their activities of daily living, even when they're lifting a laundry basket, for example. And what's important to note here is that for some people the limitation might be mobility. So you might have to work on the flexibility of the hips in order for them to be able to get down into a squat or into this type of position. And so the question would be, well, what about the abdominal region? If you're telling us not to focus on flexing the spine so much, how can we work on the abdominal region in this population? And the argument is that, in reality, for this population, and honestly for a number of people, what we're really more concerned about is the endurance of the abdominal region to resist forces. Let me give you a practical example.
If you have an elderly person and you hand them something on one side, you don't want them to be so unstable that their spine completely falls apart. You want them to be able to stand up straight and be able to resist this load, no matter what direction it's in.
Clearly my purse is too heavy. But you can build this type of endurance by simply doing things like plank pose, bird dog, and again, if you want to go into more about this type of health, just see the work of Dr. Stuart McGill. He's been researching this for years. What about power in the spine? We talked about Olympic weightlifting earlier, and we were talking about how there's two phases of the movement. There's a high power initial lifting phase, and then there's the catch phase. Well, what we're really interested in is in the initial phase. In this case, we're talking about a high pull where you take the bar from the ground and bring it up holistically. But the catch phase of the movement is not only highly technical and difficult to learn and time-consuming, it takes up a lot of time in the gym that could be used for other things, but really you're just putting them at an increased risk of injury. In fact, there's a lot of strength coaches who don't even do the catch phase. They just stick with the power part and skip the Olympic liftings for the Olympic lifters. So focus on developing power just in terms of the high power phase of the movement. And that can be done in other ways. For example, tire flipping. If it's done with the right load, it can be done quite ballistically. It'll work on triple extension, and it's also going to help to load the spine with high power. And what about the wrist? I said that was another fracture site. I feel badly if someone has one, but it's not as devastating as a hip fracture, a wrist fracture, that is. You can see in this court investigation where resistance training was done with only a load of 8 to 12 repetitions, which is pretty light. And what you'll see is that, even though this isn't statistically significant, simply doing resistance exercise in general is going to improve bone mineral density in the wrist. Focusing on the main principles of resistance exercise, you're going to get the wrist in action as well. So what not to do? We've talked about flexion of the spine, and to be honest, in our society, with most people sitting in flexion at a computer all day, doing a bunch of flexion isn't necessarily helping us or really promoting health and well-being. But we also want to avoid shear stress to the bone. As you can see in the abduction machine, if someone has low bone mineral density and you're loading the bone this way, you can predispose them to injury. And there's other better ways to work them out. But also unstable surfaces. You know, this is something that is tempting to do. We're worried about falls, we want to work on balance. But the truth is that people aren't experiencing challenges to their balance on unstable surfaces. They're slipping and falling on stable surfaces. And there's been quite a lot of research out there that has shown better and alternative ways to work on balance that don't put them in a position of possibly falling and breaking a hip. And what's really interesting is just working on neuromuscular coordination by resistance training is going to improve their balance. Not only that, but think about something like a lunge movement. You walk in a lunge, and you're definitely going to have an improvement to your balance. All right, so again, single leg emphasis, ground reactive forces, upper body load, neutral spine, and general resistance exercise for the wrist. So let's talk about implementation. We talked about frequency. In this case, we said at least twice a week. Here we have 1 out of 2. A dynamic warm-up, and then some power or ground reactive forces. Here we're talking about 3 sets of 3 reps at 30%. 30% because it's ballistically, even though it's a low load, it's done quickly, it's high power, it's high force. We're doing 3 reps because you can't ballistically do much more than that, 3 to 5 or so. Here's a vertical jump. In some populations, you'll do heel drops instead, in others you'll do plyometrics. How about high force? 3 sets of 3 to 6 repetitions, and it's a few repetitions because you're doing 85 to 93% of the 1 repetition max. It's quite heavy, you can't really do much more than 3 to 6. Here we have a 91-year-old doing a deadlift. That's one option. That's going to load her whole posterior chamber to get her lower back, her glutes, her hamstrings. But we want to even that out. We want to do a lower body push exercise. So let's bring in a lunge, where we'll get our quadriceps as well. And again, that's going to load the femoral neck and help to improve balance as well. And then in terms of the upper body, in order to facilitate a neutral spine, let's do some cable rows. That's going to hit our whole back, our posterior deltoid. It's going to get our biceps as well. And to balance out the upper body, we're doing a flat bench press. That's going to get the chest. It's going to do the anterior deltoids. It's going to get the triceps. For core endurance, simply a plank pose or something of that nature. And then some targeted static stretches to address any deficiencies this person has in terms of the mobility. And then for odd impact, aerobics on a different day could include tennis, squash, anything that helps to load the body in a different way. So just to summarize, as long as this is our model of health, we will continue to be helpless when we are young. And that will make us helpless when we are old. And so I challenge you to change our perception of this as health to the idea of a 99-year-old woman living on her own and carrying around an axe to do her activities of daily living. Thank you.